Well, usually when we do talks on the economics of religion, people think that we're talking about the wealth of churches and denominations. And they'll ask questions like, well, which is the richest denomination or church in the world? That type of thing. But no, this isn't what I'm interested in, what Robert and I study. We study how religions compete, how they price their goods, and what type of theological beliefs drive economic behavior. So when we think about the determinants of economic growth, we tend to think about openness to international trade, taxes. We tend to think about financial and monetary policies. We also tend to think about fertility, life expectancy, education, urbanization, longevity of life, real capita GDP, and savings rates. But recent studies, including our own, have shown that there's really another factor that determines economic growth, and that's culture. So our study on religion falls under culture in the study of economic growth. Religion is important in this respect because it promotes religious beliefs that inculcate values that affect productivity and labor and saving and thrift, honesty, which has an impact on trust. And that's what Robert and I have been studying for 16 years. So the theoretical framework that we use is first rational choice. Now I know a lot of people in this day and age claim that there's another choice, that's behavioral economics, but we use rational choice. And we argue that when it comes to religion, people make a voluntary choice to participate in a religion. Now it may come to mind that you may say, but look, Rachel, there are religions in which you're born, like Hinduism, which are class-related and built into political and economic systems in a society. You might think of medieval Catholicism, which was a monopoly. People were born into Catholicism. They had no choice. There was no Protestantism. So they all were Catholic. And you have to ask yourself, how voluntary was that? Well, it was voluntary. People didn't go to the cathedrals. They didn't participate. They were taxed by the church. And in fact, that was one reason why Protestantism was able to come in. The pricing of goods by the medieval Catholic Church. So we argue that, in fact, people do make voluntary choices about religion. They purchase religious goods, and they're expending time and resources on religion. They maximize their behavior, and by this we mean that they're going to be at least as well off after the interaction as they were before it. We also argue that they're utility maximizers. They engage in cost-benefit analysis. So when you join a religion, you're asking the question, what am I getting out of this? What is it giving me? And one of the things that religion gives you, and I'll talk about it in a minute, is they give you otherworldly compensators, right? If you think about it, you're going to church, you're talking to a priest or a rabbi or a minister, you're engaging in this because you're interested in salvation and damnation. You're interested in heaven and hell. You're interested in what's going to happen to you in the afterlife. So those are otherworldly compensators. When you think about rational choice, we talk about it in economic terms, or economists talk about it as demand, the demand for religion. So when you want to talk about the supply of religion, you talk about the religion market. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations laid this out in over 20 pages, the competition of religions. And he made the argument that the monopolistic Church of England was actually making priests indolent in another type of elite. And he was arguing that, in fact, England should open up its religion market so that other religions can come in and compete with it and thereby create a vibrant religion market. So the religion market model argues that religions, if there is an open market, will compete and price their goods accordingly. And they will also adjust their theological beliefs and values. In the religion market, you also have to think about governments and how governments regulate religion. There are two types of regulations that a government will impose on religion: subsidies and regulations. So, for example, Does Guatemala allow liquor on Sunday? Can you go and buy liquor on Sunday? Was there a time in which you couldn't go buy liquor on Sunday? There are different regulations in the United States. For example, stores certain sizes cannot be open before noon on Sunday. This is regulated by religion. It's regulated by nothing else but by religion. The idea is that if you regulate the market, people will have nothing else to do but go to church. And so that creates a whole distorted set of incentives about what's happening with the religion in the market. Our third leg of the theoretical framework is Max Weber. Max Weber argued that religious beliefs affect economic outcomes primarily by fostering certain character traits. And we're interested in work ethic, discipline, honesty and trust, and thrift. So if you begin to think about your own religious upbringing and what types of values you were inculcated with, and what types of things maybe your church, your congregation, your minister, your rabbi, your priest told you were values that that group held, then that's a religious institution inculcating in you certain values that then translate into economic activity. All right. So Robert and I are rather famous for taking the Max Weber thesis. And we've been accused of being more Weberian than Max Weber. And I'll explain that in a minute. So we begin with what is known as the two-way causation. We look at religion as the independent variable. We're interested in how religious beliefs have an impact on economic growth. We really want to know, what do people take away from their religion that makes them work hard, be disciplined, not look for shorter work weeks, not look to retire early, but really want to invest in labor and in productivity. And in a minute, I'm going to go through the Protestant theological positions, so you see how Max Weber ended up where he did. And I will also contrast it with social capital, so you understand the difference between these two models. So before I get into Martin Luther and John Calvin and then John Wesley and back to Max Weber, let me quickly give you an idea of what it means to have otherworldly compensators. And we call this the analytic model of salvific merit. Now, salvific merit means that there's something that you can do that will earn you a place in heaven and get you out of hell. So think of it as a game. What are you going to do in this life that's going to make it possible for you not to burn in hell? All right? And what we did was we classified world religions. We took the major world religions. Buddhism has what we call high salvific merit. What that means is that there are many things, in fact, that you can do in this world that will earn you salvific merit. Think of it as a savings bank. So that by the time you die, you could be another being. You could be a type of angel. You could be something working your way up. Hinduism, Catholicism, and Islam are what we call medium salvific merit. So there are some things that you can do in this world to earn your way into heaven, but then there's a limit. There's only so much that you can do through good deeds, good works, and then it depends on faith. It depends on God meeting you halfway through grace. So there's nothing you can do about that model. You can only do so much. So if you go to confession and you're absolved of your sins and you do penance, that's a form of salvific merit. If you try to make up for a wrong that you've done, that's a form of salvific merit. So following Max Weber's line of thinking, Robert and I went back to Martin Luther in 1517 when he tacked his theses on the church door in Wittenberg. Martin Luther had the view that what was wrong with the Catholic Church was its monastic ascetic system. Those nuns and priests who cloistered themselves into monastic communities earned salvific merit. The rest of the lay people did not. And that was the only way, one of the only ways on this earth at that time that you could earn salvific merit. Martin Luther thought that this was ridiculous. And he said there's such a thing as a calling. And this calling is not monastic and it's not ascetic. It's your calling where you were born into this world, and you work hard at it, you try to be successful, you be productive, and God's grace will come upon you. This was Martin Luther's argument. Now, what's interesting about Martin Luther was he never said that you can earn salvific merit by good works. And that's often a complaint that it's an ambiguity in his theology, by the way that he discussed how you as a Christian were supposed to behave in this world and attain God's grace. Another interesting element about Martin Luther that we look at is that Martin Luther also argued that we had to maintain political stability. Now you have to understand, when Martin Luther erupted onto the political scene in Germany, it led to quite a bit of violence and war. And so when he finally began to develop his theology, he really wanted to introduce political and social stability in Germany and in Europe at large. So he argued that if you're a tailor and your father's a tailor, if your mother is a seamstress, then you're going to be a seamstress and you're going to maintain this order, this economic, political, social order. Don't disrupt it, was what Martin Luther said. So stability in your calling came from maintaining that class social system that existed at the time in Germany. John Calvin came right after Martin Luther, and John Calvin said, no, this is wrong. This is not right. Now, if you notice what I've just said about Martin Luther, is there a Protestant ethic here? Is there a work ethic in Martin Luther when you think about what I've just told you? There's no capitalist spirit here, is there? How is he changing the system? What is the capitalist spirit?
Improvement, progress, prosperity.
Right, and how does that happen?
Individual freedom.
Individual freedom, individual effort. How you are productive and how you seek your own profit.
Not conformism.
Right, right. And so Martin Luther was arguing for a type of social-political conformity in order to maintain political stability. John Calvin in Geneva came along and he said, this is wrong. I'm going to build a city that's going to be entirely different from Martin Luther. John Calvin argued that work gave each person their own stability and order. And this step in the theology of John Calvin is essential to the rise of the capitalist spirit in the Protestant ethic. Because what it argues is that the work and labor that each of us do provides our own stability and our own sense of salvation. So what he does is he not only internalizes it, he makes it highly individualized. And hence we now have the capitalist spirit in the Protestant ethic. But he added another thing, which is very contradictory, and a lot of scholars have misinterpreted this, is the idea that there was an elect. And in the Bible, it says that there's going to be an elect, a chosen few who are going to make it into heaven. But you don't know who you are. It could be, you could be among us, but we don't know who it is. So then if you don't know epistemologically who's going to be saved, then why should you work? Why should you care? You can just be lazy, right? You can just do whatever te da la gana. You can just go and forget it. But in fact, what John Calvin found in Geneva was that this notion of predestination and the elect actually created what has been called salvation anxiety. You start worrying. Am I the one? Are you the one? I mean, how do I know I'm going to get into heaven? And it creates a type of neurosis, what Freud called salvation neurosis. And this is exactly what happens. Out of this notion of salvation anxiety, people start looking for signs. They want to know who's been saved. You know, has my neighbor been saved? You know, has the person down the street been saved? Oh, look, you know, they have a really nice car and a big house, and they're doing so well and they're successful. Are they saved? Is that the sign of being saved? So John Calvin creates this whole new type of competition and the individualistic expression of being productive and disciplined and order and what it means to be a Christian. And John Calvin goes as far as to say that if you have a better opportunity outside Geneva, leave and go take it. Now, this is revolutionary for Martin Luther. Martin Luther would have never, ever dreamed of saying that, but John Calvin does. And furthermore, he sets up in Geneva a textile industry for the indigent. John Calvin does not see poverty as a social condition. Poverty is because you're weak. Poverty is because you haven't been taught the right values and you haven't understood the connection between salvation and discipline and Christian order and working hard. So he then goes after the indigent and tries to make them more productive. So productivity for John Calvin means success. It means some type of sign that God is showing you that you're living according to the Christian virtues. So we've now passed another threshold with John Calvin's theology. We've now moved into the capitalist spirit where being productive and being successful is now viewed as a sign. Somehow, if you behave according to Christian virtues, you will be materially successful. That will be a sign. Well, John Wesley comes along, the founder of Methodism. And John Wesley, his famous line is, gain all you can, save all you can, give all you can. And John Wesley is a minister in England. He attends Oxford, and he founds the largest denomination at one point in the world, Methodism. John Wesley basically says, you will have salvific merit. You will know if you will be saved, because you'll have a warm feeling in your heart. You will have this feeling of assurance. And so what John Wesley does is brings it all the way down. This line of thinking, this Protestant theological thinking on the link between salvation, values, and material gain. So what happens with John Wesley comes up when England was in the period of Industrial Revolution. In fact, he's actually credited with saving England from social upheaval because so many were Methodists. And he argues that what you should do is work hard, you should be disciplined, and you should just be orderly and do your work. But you can do it on the grounds that you know you're going to be saved, and you're going to have epistemological certainty that you're going to be saved.
No matter what?
No matter what, whether or not you're successful or not, you're going to have assurance. Yeah, there's a famous hymn, Blessed Assurance. That's it. Yeah, that's John Wesley. So John Wesley makes this argument. And later in his life, he has several sermons where he bemoans the fact that Methodists have become very wealthy, very prosperous, and they no longer come to church. And he bemoans this. But he doesn't self-reflect. There's no sermon in which Wesley self-reflects and says to himself, maybe there's something wrong with my theology. Maybe I shouldn't say that people can have assurance that they've been saved. And so what Wesley puts his finger on, but he doesn't seem to understand, is what we call the secularization of society. So England begins to secularize. And there's also another group in England at the time, the Quakers. And the Quakers were extremely industrious. Cadbury chocolate, they were the precursors of human resources and specialization. And the Quakers who became very wealthy became known as worldly Quakers because they couldn't live within the sect. They had become too wealthy and too individually profitable. So now we're going full circle with Max Weber and the religious motivation as to what takes place in the Protestant ethic. So let me talk about religion as the dependent variable. So wait, let me just finish a minute. So what Max Weber then argues at the end of this, bringing it back to Max Weber, is that by the end of the 1800s, in the 1800s, we have become so driven by success and profit making that the underpinnings of capitalist spirit has fallen away. And we are now totally focused and driven by profit and by material goods and by obtaining wealth. Now, what Robert and I are arguing And I'm not going to make that argument today. I'm not going to go through the steps of that. But there are several researchers, including us, who are actually showing that, in fact, this is where we're more Weberian than Weber, is that, in fact, in some parts of the world, like in Switzerland, some studies have shown that, in fact, Protestants do work harder. They do prefer long work hours. They do tend to promote education more than Catholics. So, in fact, we do see the persistence of the Protestant ethic even today. And there are several studies on that. There's one study about soldiers in, I'm trying to remember which World War, and they studied the difference between Protestant soldiers and Catholic soldiers and who would volunteer to go to the front. Who were the hardest working soldiers? And they found that it was the Protestant soldiers who were more willing to go and fight than the Catholic soldiers. So we do find a persistence of the Protestant ethic working today. And the reason that the Protestant ethic is not studied a lot is because it's really hard to study. It's very hard to get survey data. It's very hard to isolate indicators, instrumental variables, to do this type of study, but it's beginning to be done. And the economics of religion as a field has been dominated by social capital. Social capital is when you look at the organization of a religion, and you argue that people join a religion because they get social goods out of it. So if you think about going to church and you're singing with everybody and you're clapping and you're having a good time, you know, you're actually enjoying it. Well, the sum of the total is larger than all of you put together. So you're actually getting more out of it. So social capital argument, the economics of religion started out in the 60s when Rodney Stark, a sociologist, was studying these radical sects that had moved into the United States. And the idea was that why would anybody want to join a radical sect where you shaved your head, you wore a yellow robe, you chanted in Hindu even though you didn't know what you were saying, those types of things. And he argued that it was very rational. This was a choice that people were making because they were getting a social good out of it. They were getting something that they couldn't get at a Methodist church, a Baptist church, a Catholic church. They were actually getting something out of it. So that's the social capital argument. Another part of the social capital argument is that highly educated people tend to discern where other highly educated people are going to church, and they'll self-select into that church so they can network with other highly educated people. That's, again, another social capital argument. But Robert and I are not making a social capital argument. We're making a Weberian argument. Okay, so the second part of the two-way causation is religion as the dependent variable. And this is how, as I mentioned with Wesley, how economic development and political institutions affect religious participation and beliefs. And I'm not going to go really a lot into depth. I'm just going to look at some indicators here. So the indicators that we looked at in terms of economic growth would be high real gross domestic product. So as countries grow richer, countries do tend to secularize. That's a known empirical fact. So as a country grows richer with higher real GDP, what happens is that your value of time is higher. You're earning higher wages, you have other things to do in life, and so your incentives to participate in a religion go down. So GDP, as it grows, actually has a negative effect on religious participation, both in terms of participation and beliefs. Now, when you think about this, and Robert and I looked at this a little bit, when you look at children, those who are in their productive years, elderly people, and women, you find that parents take their children to church, but then by the time they're bar mitzvahed or they have a communion, you reach puberty, then parents fall away, then participation falls away. And then we also find that women who are housewives, who stay at home and take care of children, also have higher religious participation because their wages are low. And then we also find that elderly people, towards the end of their life, tend to participate more in religion. So when you look at these stages in life, you'll find that those who participate more in an industrialized, in a highly rich country are those whose wages would be low in the marketplace. The other indicator we look at is urbanization. As urbanization occurs, people have more choices. They can go to the movie theater, you can go to opera, you can go dancing, you can do many, many things that you didn't have prior to urbanization. So urbanization, like real GDP, has a negative effect on religious participation. Rural, and this is also contrasted with rural areas that tend to be more affected by natural disasters. And there are a cluster of studies about natural disasters in the rural area that actually show that even though people in rural areas are more religious, when a natural disaster occurs, their religiosity spikes. They become intensely religious. And this is also true to some degree for urban folk, but it's particularly true of rural dwellers. So for example, if you have an earthquake, which Guatemala has a lot of, you can probably do surveys. If you want to do a study, an empirical study, you can do a survey after an earthquake, before and after an earthquake, to see what the religiosity level is. And you can make a comparison between urban and rural. Pick an urban town and rural, and then see what happens in those churches. Another way you can do that is by look at the tithing. Does tithing go up after an earthquake? Do people give more monetary resources to the church after an earthquake? In fact, studies show that this is the case. This happens. Human beings react that way. The other indicator is life expectancy. The longer we live, the less religious we are. But that's kind of a distorted interpretation, because as I mentioned earlier, the longer we live, we're probably less religious for a longer period of our life, but at the end of our life, we tend to become religious again. So it has somewhat of a negative impact on religiosity. The fourth one is education. Education was once thought to have a negative effect on religiosity, particularly on beliefs. So how many of you know a scientist, a physicist, a mathematician? Wow. Well, see? Okay, that would be a good thing to look at. Do scientists tend to be atheists or agnostics? Actually, the data doesn't show that. The data shows that, in fact, among them, they tend to be lower than the overall population in religiosity, but they're not non-religious. And I think we can point, I have 3 really great quotes, unfortunately, which I didn't bring, but I hope I have them in my head. Albert Einstein certainly believed that the order of the cosmos was determined by a superior being. You have Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, who argued that, in fact, religion was very important and inspired him to come with certain ideas. And likewise, John Nash, the famous mathematician, although he was schizophrenic, and a lot of people doubt what he said, if I can talk to ETs, why can't I talk to God? So there's a certain, what I'm trying to point at is that there's a certain element of creativity in the mental mind that we tend to abstract. We tend to find in creativity this realm where a lot of people think mystics dwell, and those who are very spiritual. So there seems to be an overlap in that area, which is just recently being studied by psychologists. How mystics are very much, their patterns of mental behavior is similar to very intelligent people who have these types of experiences. So abstract thinking and speculative reasoning are very important to religion. So Freud himself, later in life, came to the conclusion that religion is an illusion. It cannot be proved or disproved. It is not a delusion. It is an illusion. And so those who have that ability to engage in speculative reasoning can actually think about these things. And it cultivates a type of creativity. Now, another point I want to make here, though, with regard to Albert Einstein and the other two, is that what they're thinking about is outside the box. They're not thinking about religion in the normal sense that you and I might think about religion. They're not thinking about going to a Catholic church. They're not thinking about going into a Methodist church or going into a synagogue. They're talking about a religion that is beyond those types of parameters, traditional Orthodox parameters. What they're doing is talking about religion, about beliefs that are heterodox. And in fact, that's exactly what's happening among millennials today, is that millennials are no longer going to traditional churches. What they're doing is holding heterodox beliefs. And we call them liminals or nuns, but it's a new phenomenon, and it's growing. It's growing among younger generations, that they no longer want to be held within a doctrinal box, but they want to be able to hold beliefs from different systems at the same time. All right. So education, we actually argue, doesn't have a negative effect and potentially could have a positive effect on religious beliefs. So the secularization thesis is that societies, as they grow richer, they tend to reduce participation in formal religions, religious beliefs, and political decision making. Okay, so I guess our overall conclusion, we agree with what others have found, that richer countries tend to secularize. But the other point that I want to make is secularization is not uniform. Some countries are secularizing differently from other countries. And if you think about it, some countries are actually experiencing religious growth. So secularization is not a universal truth. Secularization is contextual, where it takes place. And Robert and I are arguing that secularization is not the opposite of religiosity, which initially it was thought to be in the 60s when sociologists first started studying this field. What we think is that secularization is a phase that religion goes through. And we also think that heterodoxy, orthodoxy are things that we as investigators have to be very sensitive to and how they play out. So we're very attuned more to beliefs and how they affect economic activity and how religious beliefs affect those values that lead to economic activity. So our findings are, as I said, we're more Weberian than Weber, and that beliefs in hell and heaven continue to be motivational drivers of economic growth. And that people who do believe in heaven and hell tend to use those to motivate them to behave in certain ways. We argue that believing is relative to belonging, and it is an important determinant of economic growth. What do we mean by that? We mean that if you spend too much time in a religion, and if you spend too many resources on a religion, then you're going to see a negative impact on economic growth. But if there's a balance between, for example, taking your children, having them inculcated with religious beliefs and values, and then letting them go, then that is probably sufficient to inculcate values that will lead to productive economic lives. So there's kind of a window, we call it a window of opportunity, where you have this balance between participating in a religion so that you're inculcated with beliefs, and then letting it go, not doing it very much after that. And we think that's sufficient. Okay, the effect of religion on economic growth depends on the extent to which an increase in attendance leads to stronger beliefs. That's our corollary. So if you go to a church, for example, those who argue for religion as social capital, if you go to a church and you're not being inculcated with the religious beliefs, then that isn't doing what we're arguing. You have to go to church to be inculcated with certain beliefs and values to have the Weberian effect that we're talking about. In other words, then going to church would be just another club. It would be like a chess club or a gardening club. It just wouldn't have that kind of effect. Okay, and I made my last point. Okay, that's it. That's what we're working on.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.